Good morning and good evening. To overcome the time zone differences, we're going to have an online talk this time. So welcome to the Hong Kong U Social Sciences Colloquium. So I'm the moderator today. So my name is Dodo Xu, Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Hong Kong U. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor David Pedulla. I guess many of you know Professor Pedulla himself and his work. So he is a professor of sociology at Harvard, and he was previously a member of the faculty of Stanford University and the University of Texas at Austin. And he received his PhD in sociology and social policy from Princeton. So it seems like he has a habit of collecting all the Ivy League schools. So his research agenda examines the consequences of non-standard, contingent, and precarious employment for workers' social and economic outcomes, as well as the processes leading to race and gender labor market stratification. And his work has appeared in many leading journals in this field, such as American Sociological Review, American Journal of Sociology and Social Forces. And his work has been supported by organizations including NSF, National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Pedulla. So I'll leave it to you, David.
Great. So thank you so much for that introduction, as well as for the invitation, Dodo. And thank you to Mary as well for coordinating my visit. I'm really looking forward to presenting this work to you all today. So the title of the talk I'm going to give is Organizational Work-Family Policies and Gendered Hiring Decisions. And before diving in, let me just get my PowerPoint working. There we go. Before diving in, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Felipe Diaz, John Munoz, and Katie Woolert, as well as my co-PI for much of the data collection was Diva Pager, who tragically passed away while we were in the field collecting data. I also want to acknowledge our incredible team of research assistants, both at Stanford and Harvard. Without them, this work really would not have been possible, as well as our incredible funders for supporting this work. So over the past 20 to 25 years, a large body of field experimental evidence across the social sciences has found that hiring discrimination exists across multiple social axes in the United States. So here, studies have used field experimental techniques to look at discrimination by race, gender, parental status, sexual orientation, natural origin, and a bunch of other social characteristics as well. And what's really interesting about this research on hiring discrimination using these field experimental techniques is that while it's incredibly powerful, it's developed largely as a literature largely separate from and in parallel to a separate large body of literature, both in sociology and management, thinking about organizations and social inequality. And as someone who kind of works in these two different literatures in different ways, and for different types of research that I do, it's always struck me as a little strange that this large body of work on kind of hiring discrimination hasn't really been integrated into the work on organizations and social inequality. And so a lot of my current research agenda is trying to think about the kind of synergies and relationships between these two literatures and how we might integrate them to generate new theoretical and empirical insights. And so the talk today is really one slice of this broader research agenda, where I'm really going to think today about how organizational work-family policies, so you can think about things like paid parental leave or subsidized childcare, how those things at the organizational level are related to gendered hiring decisions. So to give you a sense of how I'm going to structure the talk, I'm going to begin with a little bit of theoretical background and motivation and kind of where I see this project fitting into what's come before, where I think our contributions are. I'll then turn to data and methods, and just to foreshadow a bit where I'm going, I'm going to be presenting evidence from a large-scale field experiment of hiring discrimination, where we randomly assigned fictitious job applications to apply for a real job. We have randomly assigned the gender to different job applications, and then can kind of track discrimination against women using those field experimental techniques. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge that data with original survey data that we collected about the organizations in the field experiment. And then when we put those two data sets together, right, we can begin to look at the organizational level correlates of clean estimates of discrimination from the audit study. I'll then move on and present results and wrap up with some discussion conclusion and kind of thinking about where these findings leave us and where I think we can go from here. Okay, so on to the theoretical background and motivation. So for those of you who are interested in gender and labor markets, it's probably not a surprise that gender discrimination in hiring is actually a really complex process. And so we know from years and years of audit studies and field experimental work that gender discrimination in hiring is often influenced by other characteristics of the worker, as well as the broader social and economic environment. So in terms of the individual characteristics, there's a bunch of work thinking about the ways that things like parental status, race, social class background intersect to really shape how gender plays out in hiring decisions. And then there's a bunch of work thinking about the broader social and economic context. And here what I mean are things like the larger unemployment rate in the local labor market, the composition of a local labor market, and importantly, the gender composition of the occupation. So I want to share this this really nice slide or this nice graph from a Gauss and Kopic article in Science Advances that was published last year. So this is evidence from a meta-analysis that they did, where they essentially pooled all existing audit studies on gender hiring discrimination from around the world. And each dot on this figure is an estimate, a separate estimate of gender discrimination. On the x-axis, they have the gender composition of the occupation, or the percent women in the occupation. And on the y-axis, they have the conditional average treatment effect, which is essentially, you can think of that as anything below the 0 line is discrimination against women, and anything above the 0 line is a preference for women in hiring. And what you can see with the meta-analysis line is this upward sloping line, where essentially in occupations that are dominated with men, women face hiring discrimination, and in occupations that are more female dominated, women tend to face a preference in hiring. So this is kind of a standard practice in this literature, thinking about how these broader contextual features, things like occupational composition, intersect with various types of hiring discrimination, in this case with gender discrimination. What's interesting is that there's not a lot of work. There is a bunch of work at this kind of larger, kind of contextual level of labor markets or occupational features, but there's really not much work that's theorized or tested the ways that organizational context, the specific organizational features, may be related to gendered hiring decisions. And this is interesting in the US context. So we're going to kind of think about these organizational contexts in the US and specifically focus today on work-family policies. And I think it's interesting in the US context to think about work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions for a few reasons. One, in the United States and in many parts of the world, work-family policies are heavily gendered. They're heavily feminized. Women tend to use work-family policies at much higher rates. And then in the US context, what's important is that a lot of the work-family policy support has been relegated from the government to organizations. So we have very few kind of federal policies around work-family support. Some states in the US have started implementing things like paid parental leave, but it's pretty sparse and pretty scattered. And so much of what workers rely on in terms of balancing work and family life actually comes from the organization where they're employed. So if they get paid parental leave, it's because the employer is offering it. If there's subsidized childcare, it often comes from their employer. And so what I'm going to ask today is just a basic question of how these organizational work-family policies, and in particular things like paid parental leave and subsidized childcare, are related to gendered hiring decisions. And so for this project, we're really building on a large social science body of work that thinks about governmental work-family policies and how those may be related to various outcomes for women in the labor market. And so many of you may be familiar with it. There's a large body of work thinking about things like when a government or a state introduces something like paid parental leave, subsidized childcare, what does that do to things like female labor supply, to gender wage gaps, all those sorts of outcomes. And what's interesting is actually quite mixed evidence here. When you look across studies, across domains, there's some pretty strong positive effects, some pretty strong negative effects. And then there's also a bunch of recent evidence kind of pointing to null effects, that there's not much of a correlation when you look at the relationships between various governmental work-family policies and women's employment outcomes. This study by Brady et al. From 2020 was published in Socioeconomic Review. And they look across, I want to say something like 20 countries at 7 different outcomes for both women and mothers. And they find essentially null effects across the board of the relationship between these governmental work-family policies and various outcomes for women. Another thing that's important to note about this literature is that in general, the outcomes that scholars have been interested in kind of combine supply and demand side forces in their aggregate effects that they have. And what I mean by that is a lot of them will look at like the intervention of, say, a state level paid parental leave policy, and then look at, women's full-time employment. And that women's full-time employment estimate encompasses 2 different things, right? It encompasses women's decisions about participating in the labor force, and it also includes employers' decisions about hiring women into particular jobs. So it has both the supply and demand side features combined in this estimate of overall women's full-time labor force participation or other types of outcomes that this literature may look at. And so what we're interested in doing in this project today is moving from the governmental level down to the organizational level, right? So we're going to move from thinking about state level policies into organization and business policy. And we're also interested in bracketing out supply side decisions and really thinking about what is the relationship between these organizational level policies and demand side decision making of employers, and in particular, the gendered demand side decision making of those employers. So why do we think it is that there may be some sort of relationship between organizational work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions? And there's kind of coming into this project, I actually think there's pretty interesting reasons to think that these associations could go in either direction. The negative relationships, I think there's a lot of ways to think about how organizational work-family policies may actually lead to more negative outcomes for women relative to men in terms of hiring outcomes. And here we're largely drawing on a big literature on statistical discrimination. And so there's been a bunch of work thinking about how in contexts where more generous work-family policies exist, employers may end up statistically discriminating against women because women are on average much more likely to use work-family policies. And so here you can think about how this may play out in a few different ways, right? So in an environment like an organizational context where there are more supportive, more generous work-family policies, managers may have increased concerns about the challenges that may arise when people at the organization take work-family policies, or concerns about productivity. And those concerns are likely to be heavily gendered because women are going to be more likely to use those policies. And so they may say, all right, let's just increase the bar for entry to the organization for women, or in other words, we'll discriminate more against women in those contexts. And you may also, some organizations, particularly in a case like the US, where individual organizations are making decisions about how generous to be in terms of the work-family policies that they offer, it's possible that there are concerns at the organization about the financial costs of bringing in more women, particularly women of childbearing age, to the organization, who may put a financial strain on the organization by using these types of work-family policies, right? So again, there may be some, let's screen women out at the hiring interface, reducing costs that we're going to need to pay for work-family policies, right? So there's this kind of statistical discrimination framework that you could think about in contexts where organizations have more generous work-family policies. Managers and recruiters may kind of raise the bar for women, screen women out at the hiring interface, resulting in more negative consequences for women in terms of hiring outcomes. On the other hand, you may think that there may be positive outcomes for women relative to men in the context of these organizations with more supportive work-family policies. We know that hiring managers and recruiters tend to hold stereotypes of women and mothers as being less committed to work. And so there may be some ways that having work-family policies present at the organization alleviates some of those concerns. Managers and recruiters may feel like, okay, we can imagine that women are going to have the supports that they need in order to balance competing demands of work and family life, and those stereotypes may get reduced to some extent. There's also a potential organizational signaling pathway. And here what we're thinking about is organizations may actually use work-family policies as a way to signal to current employees and hiring managers that the organization is an inclusive place to work, that we want to include women and have gender diversity at the organization and kind of across ranks within the organization. And this may induce folks to have relative preferences for women at the hiring interface. And then a third option, which is kind of connected to the first around stereotypes, is that there may be some reduction in uncertainty, right? So if you're a manager or a recruiter in a context where you're hiring into the organization and thinking about, women workers maybe having children, knowing that you have supports at the organization to be able to support them through that transition to parenthood may reduce some uncertainty about the challenges you're going to face, or are you going to have high turnover and those sorts of concerns, which may lead to these relative preferences for women compared to men as well. So those are kind of the big frameworks of thinking about the main effects or the main associations that we might see between organizational work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions. We also want to pay attention to heterogeneity. So what types of variation might be interesting or might drive differential associations between different organizational policies and practices and gendered hiring decisions? The first is really thinking about policy type. And so we think about work-family policies in this paper as having like two key components. One that we call work-enabling policies. And so here what we're really thinking about is the type of policies and the type of work-family policies that make it easier for workers to show up and perform their work and kind of manage work and non-work demands. So here the classic example is childcare support, right? So having either on-site or near-site childcare, or having childcare subsidies that make it less expensive for families to afford childcare, make it so that workers are actually able to show up at the organization, be more productive, and kind of help workers to be able to do their jobs. And so we think that these types of policies are more likely to limit that negative statistical discrimination pathway. So we may be more likely to see positive associations between things like childcare subsidies and relative preferences for women. On the other side of this, we think about work-family policies that we refer to as work distancing policies. And here, these are the policies that provide distance from work or kind of separation from work to enable the worker to manage those non-work demands. So you can think of paid parental leave as the classic example, right, where it enables a worker to take time away from the workplace to deal with the birth or adoption of a child and kind of deal with the challenges that come with new parenthood. But that is one of those things that actually removes a worker from the workplace and may introduce some of these managerial challenges around how are we going to cover this leave? How are we going to distribute this work? And so we think that these types of work distancing policies may actually exacerbate statistical discrimination or concerns that managers might have about hiring women into the organization. The other type of heterogeneity that we're interested in thinking about is the broader work-family climate. And so, of course, organizations can have these policies, but these policies and organizations are also, and the workers at the organizations are embedded within these larger cultural frameworks at the organization about how supportive the climate is regarding work-family life, balancing work and family life. And so we think that this may also interact with these work-family policies in shaping the way that they influence gendered hiring discrimination. So on the one hand, we can think about, and we're going to really focus empirically today on organizations that have more toxic work-family climates or more hostile work-family climates, which we'll define as organizations with high levels of overwork and low levels of support for flexibility. And you can imagine that in these contexts, we may see more discrimination against women when work-family climate is hostile, because it may really amplify the statistical discrimination argument, and it may really heighten flexibility stigma. So in these more toxic and hostile workplace environments, you can imagine that any kind of potential worker who's going to use a work-family policy may be kind of screened out or may face additional discrimination in this context. There's also the possibility that in these more hostile environments, work-family policies may be correlated with less discrimination against women. And we think about this for a few reasons. One, these hostile workplace environments are likely to be rife with uncertainty about what's going to happen if a woman has a child, what are they going to do? And so there may be this kind of that uncertainty reduction argument that I mentioned earlier may be particularly salient in these contexts where there's a more toxic or hostile work-family environment. And the other possibility here, which I think is quite real, is that when you're in an organization that has a hostile work-family climate and there are no work family supports for any workers, that's where women are most likely to face the most extreme levels of hiring discrimination. Those are going to be really kind of like masculinized organizations that may screen women out at the hiring interface. So we would expect to see really strong, just like baseline discrimination against women in those contexts. So any movement away from that, so having any sort of work family support may mitigate some of that high level of discrimination, leading to less discrimination against women relative to men when you're in a hostile environment and some work family policies. Okay, so that kind of gives a little bit of the intuition, where we're situating this literature, how we're thinking about these relationships between organizational work family policies and hiring discrimination. And now I'll move on and think about kind of our data and methods and give you a sense of how we're going to actually look at this empirically. So in terms of our research design, the first type of data we're going to draw on is evidence from a large-scale audit study or field experiment, where we sent out over 12,000 job applications to apply for about 3,000 job postings. So we sent 4 job applications to each job posting. Our key gender manipulation was using the name of the applicant, which is pretty standard practice in this type of audit study literature. And so we had 4 women's names and 4 men's names. All of these were pre-tested and using different techniques to make sure that they were appropriately signaling the gender of the worker. And as you can see, these names also carry kind of racialized signals. And so we also have kind of you can think about a race manipulation in this experiment. And then we included a parental status manipulation as well. I'll show some results at the end looking at additional variation by race and parental status. But for the main analyses I'm going to focus on the main gender manipulation of the men's names versus the women's names. The second type of data I'm going to draw on is this survey we did of the organizations that were part of the audit study. And so I'll draw on data. We have 1,070 organizational surveys that we're able to match to the audit study data. So essentially our data structure ends up being just over 4,000 job applications nested within just over 1,000 organizational surveys. And the main thing that I'm drawing on today is a set of questions on the organizational surveys that asked about the work family policies that are present at the organization. But we also have a bunch of information about these organizations, right? So we collect information on organizational structure, hiring practices, how they organize work, etc. So in terms of actually collecting the data, for the audit study sample, we have data from 20 US labor markets, and we selected the 20 largest metropolitan statistical areas, so essentially the 20 largest cities, without repeating a state. And we did this in part because large cities in the US are clustered in a few states, and we didn't want to end up with a bunch of MSAs in Texas and California. We wanted to kind of spread things out across the US. And then we have 6 occupations. So we picked 3 college degree occupations, so computer programmer, administrative assistant, and higher end sales. You can think about the higher end sales jobs as being kind of like business to business type sales positions. And then we had 3 high school degree occupations, so cook, customer service, and lower end sales, or like retail sales type positions. And we sampled our job postings from 2 main sources. First was a major online job posting website, one of the big ones that's been used in previous studies. So here you may be familiar with sites like monster.com, indeed.com, career builder, those types of sites that kind of are large aggregators of job openings or where companies can put job postings. And then our second source is an aggregator of essentially all, and I say all in quotation marks, it's not quite all, but it's pretty close to every new job posting in the United States in a given day. And so essentially what we did is we partnered with Burning Glass Technologies, which is this company. They've now changed their name. When we were running the study, it was called Burning Glass, and they every day scrape the entire internet for every new job posting in the United States. So we essentially contracted with them, and every day would get a new data extract of all the new job postings in the United States, and then we could sample from that universe for the jobs that met our criteria in terms of occupation and labor market. And so I'll just briefly note, we have these 2 sampling sources in part because a lot of previous audit studies had just used the first option of just like one of these main online job posting websites. And we wanted to see, do the findings kind of translate or look different depending on the sampling sources. And we published a paper looking at mainly at racial discrimination and does it vary between different ways that you can sample jobs. We published that paper in Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. showing that we actually don't see major differences in the estimates of racial discrimination depending on how you sample for job postings. But that's just a brief side note on the sampling procedures and why we did these two different sources. In terms of implementing the organizational survey, we actually partnered with Cornell Survey Research Institute to run the survey. We felt like we ran the audit study in-house with our own research team and our graduate students and postdocs. But running an organizational survey is such a specific skill and such a complicated thing to do that we partnered with Cornell because they have a lot of experience with they have a really strong kind of labor relations school there. They've done a lot of organizational survey work. And so we partnered with them for the actual implementation of the survey itself. And so essentially what we do is we would run the audit. We would get them all the names of all the organizations in the audit study, and then they would reach out to the companies to try to get the survey completed by each of the companies in the audit study. And our target respondent was someone who was involved with hiring for the actual position in the audit study. And ultimately, 35% of our completed audits are able to be matched to completed surveys, which for those of you who do organizational work is, 35% seems a little bit low for an individual level survey, but for an organizational survey was actually quite good. And we were pretty pleased being able to get to 35%. And even just getting to 35% required an incredible amount of work. I mean, the folks at Cornell were following up with companies, 15, 20 times to try to get the right person on the phone to complete the survey. So that was like a huge undertaking to try to get as many completed surveys as possible. Okay, in terms of measurement, our key measures from the audit study, our key dependent variable is, did a given application receive a callback for the job? And callbacks are standard dependent variables for audit study research. Essentially, it encompasses any positive response from the employer that's not automated. So you do receive a lot of automated responses of like, oh, we've received your application. Those are not callbacks. This is like an individualized positive response from the employer. And then our key independent variable is going to be the perceived gender of the job applicant. So is the job applicant likely to be perceived as a man or a woman? In terms of the organizational survey, here we're bringing in the kind of organizational context. And so for organizational work-family policies, we have information about, do they have paid parental leave? Do they have on-site or near-site childcare? And do they offer vouchers or subsidies for childcare or dependent care? So I'll present models and look at each of these separately, like how do these correlate with gendered hiring decisions? And then we also create a count variable for the number of work-family policies at the organization, ranging from 0 to 3, essentially giving us a sense of like the overall generosity of the work-family policy system at the organization. In terms of the organizational work-family climate, so the kind of cultural aspects of work and family life at the organization, we have 6 items that we use factor analysis to combine. And these are items coming from standard scales that ask questions like, it is best to keep family matters separate from work? We're kind of able to develop take 6 items like that, use factor analysis, and it's very clear from the factor analysis that there are 2 main factors. One that has to do with the overwork culture at the organization, so really needing to be on call all the time, as well as one that focuses on flexibility and essentially having the flexibility to deal with non-work demands. And so what I'm going to focus on today is really the high overwork, low flexibility organizations, or the organizations where there's, really complicated or kind of more hostile work-family climates. And that's going to kind of be the main empirical focus for today. And so how we identify those organizations is we essentially split the overwork and the flexibility variables at their median, and then assign each organization into a quadrant of that 2 by 2. And then we have this one quadrant that's the high overwork, low flexibility quadrant that we'll focus on as a subset of organizations. To give you a sense of the distribution of policies across our sample, about 40% of organizations offer paid parental leave, just under 10% offer on-site childcare, and about 23% have dependent care subsidies. And then in terms of the work-family policy count variable, what you can see that's actually quite interesting is nearly half of organizations have no work-family policies at all that they offer. And then about a third have 1 policy, about 14% have 2, and there's a few organizations that offer all 3. So in terms of our analytic approach, how are we actually gonna think about analyzing the data? So we merge the audit study data with the organizational survey data, and then each observation in the data set is an application from the audit study or field experiment. And so you can think of essentially like each organization shows up 4 times and each application is in the data set once. For our primary models, we're going to estimate linear probability models with organizational fixed effects and standard errors clustered at the organizational level. We're going to regress callbacks on being a woman applicant and an interaction between being a woman applicant and the organizational work-family policy measure of interest. The main effect of the work-family policy is absorbed by the organizational fixed effect. And a positive interaction would essentially indicate a higher callback probability for women relative to men when the work-family policy is present compared to not being present. And we'll present the models 2 different ways. I'll present a base model that essentially just controls for the occupation we applied to, the metropolitan statistical area, as well as the job posting source. All of those interacted with gender, as well as the applicant race and applicant parental status. So that's kind of a base model of just like key aspects of the research design itself being controlled for. And then we run a set of full models where we add controls for all sorts of organizational characteristics like the number of full-time employees, age of the organization, whether it's part of an organization, do they receive government contracts, those sorts of things. Okay, so on to the results. I'll start with some just descriptive findings just to give you a sense of what the data looks like descriptively, and start with overall callback rates by gender. So in our match sample, essentially in the sample of audits that are able to be matched to organizations, so our actual analytic data set for this, for what I'll present later, women are called back 17.2% of the time, and men are called back 15.4% of the time. So a difference of a 1.8 percentage point callback difference. That's significant at the 0.1 level. And in our full sample, so our full like over 12,000 job applications, we see men called back 15%, women called back 16% for a difference of 1 percentage point difference between men and women in the full sample. And then when we pool the data and actually look, are the gendered callback gaps different for the matched and unmatched sample? We see that there's no statistical significant interaction there, giving us some confidence that the full sample and our matched sample are not wildly different from one another in essentially the organizations that completed the survey are not entirely different from those that didn't complete the survey, at least in terms of their propensity to discriminate. Okay, so to give you a sense of what the distribution, the kind of descriptive distribution looks like when we break things down by gender, as well as policies being present or not, I'll present a set of figures showing that. So here on the y-axis, we have the overall callback rate, and then callbacks for men and women broken down by whether paid parental leave is present or not present. And what you can see here is it doesn't look like there's much variation between the policy being present or not being present. Women are called back about 1 to 2 percentage points more, both when paid parental leave is absent as well as when it's present. In terms of on-site childcare, it's a similar pattern, although it does look here that the kind of like gap between the callback rates for men and women may be slightly larger when on-site childcare is present. And here for subsidized childcare, it actually looks quite similar to paid parental leave, where there's this small, slightly higher callback rate for women compared to men, but it doesn't seem to look much different between having subsidized childcare and not having subsidized childcare. So that just gives you a kind of a snapshot of what the data look like, kind of unadjusted with no controls. So when we put this into a regression models and use the modeling strategy that I mentioned, this is what those results look like. And essentially what I'm going to do here is model 1 and 2. I'll present estimates separately for each of the or essentially for all the policies separately, where model 1 will be with no control or the basic controls, and model 2 will be the full controls. In models 3 and 4, what I'll do is I'll use that summary measure, the count variable of number of work-family policies ranging from 0 to 3. Model 3 will have the base controls. Model 4 will have the full controls. So you can see with model 1, which is our base model looking separately at these policies, all the coefficients are positive, indicating a relative preference for women compared to men when the policy is present versus not, but none of them reach statistical significance, and the same for the fully controlled model. So we're overall looking at these policies separately, we're seeing kind of null effects or no we're not able to identify kind of any associations between these work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions. When we look at the summary measure, we see kind of a similar kind of null effect for the base model. And then when we have the fully controlled model, we see this kind of like small positive statistically significant interaction. We don't want to overinterpret that because it's the only case where we see this association, but we do see this slight positive association between the number of work-family policies and the relative preference for women in terms of hiring. Okay, so that's kind of the overall, what do we see in the data? I'll note here, and I'll circle back to this in the discussion and conclusion, but you can also see here that we're not seeing much variation across the different types of policies. So we had this, intuition that you might see more statistical discrimination for paid leave, less statistical discrimination for on-site childcare. We might see some variation between the different types of policies, and it really doesn't seem like that's the case in the full sample. So next, what I want to do is just show you what the predictive marginal effects looks like for that count variable. And so what you can see here is essentially the number of work-family policies is on the x-axis. The marginal effect of being a woman is on the y-axis. And what you can see is when no work-family policies are present, essentially there's nearly identical callback rates for men and women, and then it kind of slowly ticks up as you move through the increased number of work-family policies. So I think it's just helpful. Sometimes interaction terms can be a little tricky to think about and interpret, and so this is nice to just be able to kind of see what that looks like. Okay, in terms of now thinking about, so we don't see much variation between the different types of policies, but what about by the kind of, when we look at these organizations that have more hostile work-family climates, what is the relationship between organizational work-family policies and gender discrimination for those organizations? So here I'll focus in model 1 on the kind of separate policies. Model 2 will be for the work-family benefits count variable, and I'll just present evidence from the fully controlled models. So what's interesting here is that we actually do see this large and positive interaction between paid parental leave and being a woman, indicating that in these more toxic workplace environments, their paid parental leave tends to be correlated with less discrimination against women. And we see something quite similar for the count variable, where essentially as you have more supportive or more work-family benefits at the organization, again, amongst these more hostile work-family climates, we do see this positive association or this increased preference for women relative to men. So again, I'll show the marginal effects graphs just to give you a sense of what this actually looks like. And I think this helps kind of interpret or understand what's going on in the data. And so what you can see here for paid parental leave is that with the no paid parental leave, we're essentially seeing about you can interpret this as about a 5 percentage point lower callback rate for women relative to men. So again, this is like hostile work-family climate, no paid parental leave. Women are much less likely to get called back than men. And then that's the inverse is the case when paid parental leave is present at these organizations. And we see something quite similar when we look across the number of work-family policies. So this is kind of in line with one of those arguments I laid out at the beginning about in organizations that are hostile work-family climates and don't have work-family policies, those may be the places where we're most likely to see discrimination against women. And then moving off of that in any way, such as having some policy present, may mitigate some of that discrimination. And it looks like that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing here with these estimates. Okay. So now I'm going to move on and present some additional analyses that may kind of be on your mind and thinking about these findings. The first two I'm going to look at are, is there something going on with race in the background that may be kind of muting out, or there may be heterogeneity by race that's making kind of obscuring some of the findings that I presented? And similarly, what's going on with parental status? Might the findings be really strong for parental status and less strong for when parental status isn't signaled, and might that be kind of masking some important heterogeneity? So I'll look at both of those. I'm then going to look at, when we think about concerns about selection or omitted variables for this type of project, the thing you might be most concerned about is that organizations that are kind of quote unquote high road organizations or organizations that are just better organizations may be both more likely to have work family policies, and that may be related to gender discrimination. So I'll run an analysis where we add in actually a control as a proxy for being a high road organization. And then I'll show you a validity check on our measure of organizational work-family climate. Okay, so in terms of is race further moderating these relationships between gender and work-family policies? Here, essentially what I did is took our main models from the full organizations and just added in an additional interaction with being an African-American job applicant, as well as all the two-way interactions. And what you can see here is just plotting these three-way interactions. None of the three-way interactions are statistically significant. We may not be super well powered for a three-way interaction, but at least it doesn't look like the racial feature is masking really important heterogeneity that we would miss otherwise. Now I'll do the same thing with the parental status manipulation. So does parental status further moderate these kind of gender and organizational work-family policy interactions? And again, these point estimates are really close to 0. This may not be particularly surprising, right? The way that gender operates in the labor market is employers often have pretty strong stereotypes of women, and young women in particular, as likely to be parents. And so the actual information about parental status might not be particularly salient. And I should note that on the resumes, we kind of standardize the resumes by age. And so most of the job applicants were likely to be perceived as kind of being late 20s to early 30s, which would be kind of prime childbearing years anyways. And so these parental status perceptions might already be baked in to the way that gender is playing out. Next, what I wanted to do is, so amongst where we actually do see some movement with work-family policies, right, is amongst these more hostile work-family climates. But you might be concerned, right, that there's something going on there with being a high-road organization or being a more generous organization or a better organization. And so what I'm going to do for these analyses is add in a proxy for being a high-road organization. And so what we did is in the survey data, we have information about a large set of benefits that organizations offer to their employees. So things like profit sharing, paid sick days, all those sorts of things. And so we create a summary measure of all those sorts of benefits that are offered to workers and add that in as an additional control in our models to see if that attenuates our estimates. And essentially what you can see here is we had that kind of large association between paid parental leave and being a woman amongst these more toxic organizations. You can see that finding holds when we add in this additional control. And very similarly, when we add in the control, we see the same pattern for the count of work-family benefits remains positively and statistically significantly associated with callbacks and its interaction with gender, even after controlling for being a high-road employer. So it doesn't seem like these findings are being driven entirely by something about like the generosity or high-road status of the organization. Okay, lastly, in terms of a validity check. So our biggest concern with this kind of our work-family climate measure, right, is that we're getting it from one worker at the organization, the person who's completing the survey. And so it may not be a good representation of the overall work-family climate at the organization. And so what we're going to do is we drew a random sample of 100 organizations from our data. And then we looked up those organizations on Glassdoor. So Glassdoor is an organization that essentially current employees can write reviews of their companies that they work for. And one of the kind of summary measures that you can get from Glassdoor is about the work-family balance at the organization. And so we essentially take the work-life balance score for these organizations and merge it into our data set. And out of the 100 that we selected from our data set, we were successfully able to match 78 of those organizations with Glassdoor data. And then we look at the correlations, just like the basic correlations between our measures of overwork and flexibility and this work-family balance score from the Glassdoor data. And what you would anticipate, right, is that overwork would be kind of negatively correlated with the Glassdoor work-life balance score, and flexibility would be positively correlated with the organizational work-life balance score. And that's exactly what we see. So we see the baseline correlation at negative 0.36 between the Glassdoor measure and our kind of overwork measure, and 0.17 between our flexibility measure and their work-life balance measure. And so, well, not a perfect way to validate this measure. It gives us some confidence that even our single person at the organization is picking up something real about these organizations that other workers are seeing as well. Okay. So where does this all leave us? I think it's useful with any study to talk kind of explicitly about the limitations, and so this study is certainly not without limitations. Um, I think the first is right, there's a huge causal identification challenge here where work-family policies are not randomly assigned to organizations, and so we may be concerned about unobserved selection. For any of you who do organizational work, it's really hard to think about how to get around these kind of selection issues with organizations. There aren't like great instrumental variable approaches that I would feel confident in the exclusion restriction. We've spent a lot of time thinking about, are there any plausible instruments that we could use here to try to get more causal traction? And I don't feel confident that any of them kind of meet the necessary assumptions. So this selection concern really does remain in the background. Another real challenge with work-family policies, we know from great qualitative work in sociology that the ways that work-family policies get implemented within organizations varies a ton. And we don't have information on the actual implementation of these policies on the ground. And so we don't know kind of like, we don't know some basic aspects of the policy, so like how long a paid parental leave policy is, but we also don't know what the kind of implementation is within the organization itself, and that could mask important heterogeneity. As I mentioned on the last slide, our measure of work-family climate at the organization comes from one person. We try to validate this with the Glassdoor data a little bit, but it is tricky to get a great measure of organizational climate given the data structure that we have. And then, of course, our audit study is limited to the occupations and labor markets that we included in the study, right? So there are real questions about generalizability. If we were to look at more rural areas or other metropolitan statistical areas, as well as kind of other types of occupations, we may see something quite different. Okay, so in terms of wrapping up with kind of where does this leave us? Overall, we find limited evidence of a direct association between organizational work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't see differences between the kind of work-enabling policies like childcare subsidies and work distancing policies like paid parental leave, which I was actually kind of surprised about. You'd think that that would be a salient kind of differentiator between how these policies might play out. And our findings don't align with what would be expected from a standard statistical discrimination argument. So amongst our full set of organizations, we're not seeing this kind of like discrimination against women at the hiring interface. It doesn't kind of seem like managers are trying to screen women out or keep women out of the organization when there are these more supportive work-family policies in place. But on the other side, we also don't find a straightforward kind of stereotype, organizational signaling, or uncertainty reduction arguments. So these aren't kind of like positive associations across the board either. Rather, what I think the results point to is a complex and contingent picture of the relationship between organizational work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions. And what we see is that in these contexts where there's more hostile kind of work-family balance climate, the absence of the policies is associated with really large discrimination against women, but then that gendered callback gap closes or even reverses when these organizations have more supportive work-family policies that are in place. And so what I think this pushes us to do as scholars of work-family policies and gender inequality is to think about multidimensional, multi-level theoretical frameworks that can help to better conceptualize the connection between organizational work-family policies and gendered hiring decisions. And so with that, thank you all so much, and I will look forward to your questions.